All right. So we'll start off with a poll: Berkeley or Stanford? No, it's on behalf of Berkeley and Stanford. It's such a pleasure. Bobby Bartlett and I, we're going to give a bit more background on this project when we transition to the roundtable. But we thought we would start things off with a panel to kind of explore the framework of governance from crisis, ending up in the New York Times, to thinking about it in a value sense, which is going to be part of our conversation today. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Kristen Savell, who is a Berkeley Law alum and the co-director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University. And she helped put together and is going to moderate our panel to kick things off. But feel free to grab lunch now, or in 45 minutes, we're going to transition to the roundtable. The roundtable itself will be Chatham House rules. And then if any of our panelists want to stay and ask questions, we'll do that at the beginning of the roundtable. But for now, I will turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you, Adam. And thanks so much to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Oh, can you hear me all right? Okay, you want me to use it anyway? Okay, all right. Thank you for joining us today to talk about private company governance, about the importance of building strong boards and using those boards effectively, and about how we can get more private companies to focus on governance at an early stage, because I'm pretty sure no one in the audience wants their portfolio company to be the subject of Mike or Aaron's next expose. So my goal is to start a conversation about governance in this fireside chat. It will carry over into the roundtable discussion and hopefully beyond. All right, I'm going to run through some really quick introductions that will not do justice to this incredible panel of speakers, and then we will get started. Aaron Griffith is a reporter for the New York Times, covering tech companies in Silicon Valley with a primary focus on startups and venture capital. Mike Isaac, to her left, is also a reporter for the New York Times, covering tech companies in Silicon Valley. Mike is the author of the excellent book, Super Pumped, The Battle for Uber, which was, of course, made into a TV series. Matt Blumberg is co-founder and CEO at Bolster, which, among other things, connects growing companies with experienced executives and board members. Matt is the author of several books, including the latest edition of Startup Boards, which was co-authored by Brad Feld and Mahendra Ramzagani. And finally, Greg Sand is an early-stage investor for over 20 years. He's the founder and managing director at Costa Noah Ventures and serves on the board of the National Venture Capital Association, as well as many private companies. So welcome, everyone. I want to start with the bad stuff, with the missteps, the frauds, the failures, so we can all level set around the cost of bad governance, but then I promise we will end on a more positive note. So Greg and Matt, collectively, the two of you have been involved with dozens and dozens of private company boards. Matt, you've written a book all about startup boards. So in your experience, what are the most common governance missteps that private companies make? Start off with a big one.
Well, I mean, the fundamental thing I think is not starting a board soon enough. I think that the current trend is towards safes and towards tons of small firms contributing small checks and nobody leading and going on the boards is actually a problem. I think we get less good governance. There's more capital available, and that's a good thing, but we get less good governance. I think investors lead around people who get a board seat, and some of them are just people who shouldn't be on boards. And on the other hand, you got to raise money for your companies. And I think in a world where everybody is so busy, boards not meeting frequently enough, or not being able to set the expectation that people have done the work and done the preparation in advance, so that you're able to penetrate a little deeper. I think those are sort of the original mistakes.
Great. Anybody want to add any missteps?
Yes to all of those. Yes to all those that Greg mentioned, and I think I'd add one to it, which you can't get to unless you have a board, and unless you have probably a board with some independent directors on it, which is, I think startup boards don't think of themselves as being in charge of oversight. I think they think of themselves as strategic advisory boards, and that they're there to serve at the pleasure of the founder, to give advice, to open doors, make introductions to customers, et cetera, but don't necessarily think of themselves as providing an oversight role, where if you go to the other extreme end of things, right, a Fortune 500 board, they think of themselves as an oversight board that maybe helps a little bit on strategy on the margin. So I think the balance may be a little bit off, but what I would add to that is startup boards typically don't have committees for a while, like sometimes many, many years. And the board might only be 3 people. Or even if it's 5 people, they still don't have an audit committee or a nom and gov committee. And I think the board forgets that they're responsible for that as a committee of the whole. They just don't kind of make that a topic. And what I would say, and I have an interesting piece of experience, which is before I started this company, I was CEO somewhere for a little over a quarter. And the company discovered a tremendous amount of fraud and ethical problems that had happened in the past. And one of my learnings from that is that a CEO who is determined to do something bad and who has a complicit CFO or a complicit head of sales will do something bad and make it a little hard to find. And there's nothing any governance in the world can do to stop that from happening. But a board that takes its responsibilities seriously and has an audit committee or some sort of oversight function that they exercise can usually find those things. But they need to look for early warning signs, and they need to be talking to people confidentially deeper in the organization. I'm happy to talk more about any of that, but.
We are going to come back to that and talk about some of those warning signs in a little bit. These are important missteps. I don't think most of these are going to show up in the pages of the New York Times on their own, but what is showing up more and more is stories about founders behaving badly, and notably, in many cases, facing some pretty serious repercussions for that misconduct. To name just a few of these founders, Manish Lakwani, co-founder of the software startup Headspin, was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison for defrauding investors. Trevor Milton, founder of the electric vehicle company Nikola, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for lying about Nikola's technological capabilities. Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani are currently serving decade-long prison sentences for defrauding investors at Theranos. And of course, FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in prison in order to pay $11 billion in forfeiture for his fraudulent schemes. This is just a small sampling. I actually had a really long list going, and I thought, oh, it'd be fun if I made a slide and put it up on the screen for the beginning of the conversation. But I thought that would be a bit demoralizing, so we'll go with the short list here. Right. So Aaron, what do you think is going on here? Are more founders misbehaving, or are regulators and the media just paying more attention?
I mean, that's both. Definitely. I mean, if you look at just the amount of money that has poured into the venture capital ecosystem over the last decade, it's increased by more than 8-fold. And so when there's essentially free money available, that's going to attract all kinds of people. Like, more entrepreneurs are going to be attracted to the sector, but also more people who see an opportunity to commit fraud. And especially in the last kind of 2021 crazy period when diligence seemed to have just gone completely out the window, the opportunity to stretch the truth a little bit or kind of cut corners was just available to the kinds of people that were willing to take it. And I think that the system, this might be a controversial view, but it's kind of baked into the system that you should push the boundaries of what is possible. You raise a lot of money, you're shooting for the moon, and you're trying to make something that has never happened before happen. So it's kind of like baked into the system. You know, the founders and the board are pushing the entrepreneur, like, grow faster, spend our money faster. A certain type of person is going to take advantage of that. So that's what we've seen over the last decade. And then on the other side, as these companies become so big and the stakes are so much higher, people like Mike and I in the media are scrutinizing these companies a lot more. Employees and, you know, board members or other people, are whistleblowers, are seeing this and coming to us or going to regulators and saying, like, something's going on here. And then the Justice Department has really stepped up their enforcement of all kinds of white-collar crime. I think I had it in a story last week that they've prosecuted more than 100 white-collar frauds over the last 2 years, which is a record for them. So I think it's coming from all sides, and that's why there are a lot more stories of startup fraud that wind up in the New York Times. And if you guys see any and want to leak it to us, email us. You can find us very easily.
You touched on a few different narratives that often emerge in the press after news of misconduct breaks. So you often hear the board failed in its oversight, VCs failed in their due diligence, or founders are taking the Silicon Valley fake it till you make it mantra too far. So I'm curious, which of the narratives do you feel holds the most water?
Well, I mean, I can maybe answer that by talking about this, the Headspin case, because that just happened last Friday. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing, and there was a really interesting debate between the judge and the lawyer who was defending this founder, Manish Lachwani, founder of Headspin, raised $100 and some million from big investors like GV and Iconic. He was inflating ARR. He was lying about who was a customer. There was a lot of kind of shady things, and the worst part was that he had fabricated some kind of invoice thing. So he pled guilty. He was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison, and while they were debating whether or not he deserves to go to prison, his lawyers were saying, listen, the investors knew about this. They had said, there were emails that show that they knew the ARR was a little wonky and we could fix it and we'll push him to hire a CFO. And he just blew them off for years. And so, the board didn't necessarily have control and they didn't know about this. So it kind of there's this debate where it's okay, well, he was faking it, he was lying, they kind of knew, they let it go, and they were, so anyway, the judge essentially came down and said, it doesn't matter if you lie about your financials. I want to send this message to all entrepreneurs as a deterrent that if you lie about your financials to investors, even if they kind of know about it and they're okay with it, you're going to go to jail. And so I think the debate is really where that kind of faking it, exaggerating hype crosses over into fraud. And we're finding out that the judges and the Justice Department has a very clear view of that.
Mike, anything to add on that?
No, that's I'm sending a message thing is super interesting. I keep wondering how much things have shifted. Every time some big fraud happens, to your point, the board gets blamed or sort of oversight issues come into play, and everyone says Sequoia deletes a letter from their website on how cool FTX was and Sam Bankman-Fried. But I always wonder when the dynamics are supposed to shift back to, okay, we are gonna put as much oversight as possible because still, if we're in this era, at least in AI investment, where money is very easy to come by and you can get it from whoever you want, the idea of being founder friendly is usually the thing that folks have to come to the table with, right? And founders, especially maybe young founders who are not used to how to run a company or how to run a eventually public company, might be more open to people who aren't going to be harping on them as much or freaking out about doing things the right way. So we always sort of hear about this correction, but I'm wondering if that's ever going to change, to your point about it being baked into the system. And there's probably a happy medium or sort of responsible way of at least having some grown-ups in the room or compliance people in the room that can say, hey, you can do marketing, but you can't fudge your P&L, right? But I don't know. I just feel every 3 to 5 years, some tech hype cycle, whether it's real or not, comes around. Huge blow up happens. We say it's going to be different, and then at the same time, it's very competitive to get into every one of these AI startups that are shooting up in valuation. So it might be a little cynical, but I'm just curious.
Right. Well, part of why we are here today is to maybe course correct a little. You brought up AI. Actually, that's a nice transition point because I wanted to talk a little about OpenAI. They have a really unique governance structure that contributed to the company going sideways for a hot minute last fall. I would love it, Mike, if you can tell us really briefly what happened with OpenAI, where things currently stand, and whether you think that will be a governance success story in the long run.
OpenAI is like a fascinating case study in the gnarliest way governance can go, probably, particularly because it was not set up to be or still is not, like a LLC for-profit company necessarily. It's a nonprofit with all these weird sort of investment structures bolted onto the side because management, Sam Altman and others on the top were into that sort of idea and also feel hamstrung by the way it was set up initially. I also wonder whether the early ideals of the company have kind of been guided into new attitudes by how crazy successful it is now, or at least how crazy sort of lauded it is and at the top of this race. As you all probably knew, we were writing about the relatively small board of people ousted Sam briefly in a board coup that they ended up losing because most, if not all, of the company is behind Sam for being untruthful or untoward, but at the same time never really fully substantiated or at least made concrete sort of assertions as to what that was. I think it's one of those really fascinating things where OpenAI just became this phenomenon in a relatively short amount of time, even though they've been around for a very long period of time. And one thing I'm curious about is when a company outgrows its board so quickly, how do you really handle that? How does AI, to be clear, AI is not a new discipline. It's now hot, but it's been around for a very long time. And now companies like OpenAI, which weren't really that paid attention to and thought of as more academic for a long time, are now, very important and high profile. And they had people on the board who had, let's say, different incentives, right? They were very worried about AI going crazy and we need to sort of curb this. They were worried about, they were not worried about financials really in any way. And I would say at some point, they probably should have had to do a real rethink of what they wanted their board to look like. And that came to a head anyway, and they had to do it regardless. And I think the new governance seems to be aligned with management, I guess is what I'd say. Whether you think that's a good thing or not, or whether you think that's a board's responsibility to be on team management the whole time. But yeah, it was this fascinating case where everything gets so big so quickly that governance was maybe the last thing in some folks' minds at some point until it was very front and center.
Greg, do you have something you want to add?
I mean, I think the OpenAI story is a little bit like being a child media star, and it rarely turns out well for things that are underdeveloped and not ready to be companies. And a board really serves. You can sort of think of it as ballast, right? It's not that it's the foundation of the company, because the people in the company are the foundation of the company, but it is intended to slowly change, right? And it's relatively hard to evolve it very quickly. And in this case, very unusual, right? It just broke and it cracked, and they had a chance to do it over again. But I think as it relates to the kinds of companies that we're dealing with, it just, you add a director, even an independent, they're going to be on the board for at least 3 years. You add a director who's an investor, they're going to be on the board as long as there is a company. And so you just have to be really careful about who you put on the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, at the end of the day, it's up to the shareholders. And I find the example of Theranos fascinating, right? They built a board that was not equipped to be a board. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, but actually, it's not up to the shareholders. In public companies, the shareholders vote. But in private companies, they don't. Usually somebody who leads around that firm gets to appoint a person in perpetuity until they're public. And by the way, that person may turn over multiple times too. So ideally, you're looking for firms that have stability, not just people that have their own, I'll call it, emotional stability.
Theranos had a very bad board, and I think that is now a case study. I mean, they had a very high pedigree board, but James Mattis testified in court that when he was asked to join the board, he he bought a book on how to be a board member and read it. And that was like all he knew. And Henry Kissinger talked about how he found the board meetings boring and too long. And like, so these guys are not paying attention, and
They're what we call in the search business trophy board members.
They absolutely were. And now, as reporters, when we see that kind of thing, we like celebrities on boards is a very common thing, especially with the SPACs, but with lots of other startups too. And that is like kind of a red flag almost, where it's like, oh God, this founder is looking for vanity. They're not looking for, and that might serve some purpose. Maybe it helps with advertisers, maybe it helps recruiting, but they're not looking for someone who's going to provide them like oversight on this board.
One of them is good for that, not a whole board full of them.
Yes.
Right.
Right. It underscores the importance of understanding what skill sets you need on your board and really composing the best board possible, not the highest pedigree board possible. Which actually kind of brings us to the next topic. We've talked quite a bit about the costs of poor governance, but I want to shift the narrative and focus on the benefits of good governance practices that can help private companies to grow and scale successfully. So we spent the first part of the conversation talking about founder misbehavior, and I mentioned that one of the criticisms you often hear in the wake of an incident of founder misconduct is, where was the board? So Matt, what can private company directors do better in their oversight role when it comes to deterring and detecting unethical or illegal behavior before things go too far down the wrong path? For example, are there warning signs they should be looking for, which you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. Paying attention to early warning signs is really important, and early warning signs are not always obviously about fraud or mismanagement, right? Early warning signs are about opacity, they're about greed, they're about invincibility, sort of the imperial founder, the imperial CEO. And they're about small things, right? Small things grow into big things over time. So if there's no one at the board level looking at the CEO's expenses because the CFO signed off on them, that's a problem. If there is no one on the board or the audit committee that's having a closed-door confidential conversation with not just the CFO, but the controller and the staff accountant and the payables person, just to say, hey, this is a safe space. Is there anything you've seen this year that doesn't look right to you? Or the RevOps person, if you're talking about someone that's fudging ARR or fudging their churn numbers, right? Those are not hard things to do. Audit committees should do more than sit through the one meeting a year with the accounting firm that says, yep, it's GAAP. Like, that's not helpful. A lot of things can be GAAP.
That's the other red flag that seems to be the case, like a through line of all of these companies that I've covered that have wound up in court, is that they are using QuickBooks or that they have like a part-time CFO or like a bookkeeper, but not a real CFO. Like, it just is like almost to a T. They all have that in common.
Yeah, but they still have auditors, right? A venture firm's not going to invest in a company that doesn't have audited financials.
Somehow Theranos got away with not doing an audit for like 7 years.
Well, so now you're back to a true board and shareholder dysfunction, right? But auditors don't catch all this stuff either. And the company I was talking about earlier, not only were they audited by a Big Four, but when the company changed hands from venture back to private equity, a different Big Four came in and for $250,000 did a quality of earnings analysis, and they didn't flag any of this stuff either. It's a determined CEO with a complicit CFO or head of RevOps can hide things, but they're not that hard to find. You just have to know where to look.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Mike?
No, I was just going to say, I really do agree that, like, at the end of the day, if someone is intent on doing fraud and making it at least somewhat more difficult to find, like, I think you can only blame the board to a certain degree to that level. But if there's like, a bunch of lies and obfuscation that is at least more difficult to get around, then like I have a little bit more sympathy, I guess is what I would say.
I was actually going to ask, does it absolve the board if they say, well, the founder lied to me just like they lied to the other stakeholders?
I don't think so. A determined CEO can get away with stuff, but it's not all that hard to find. You just have to spend a little bit of time looking and asking questions, I would say. What do you think?
Yeah, I assume anybody in that situation would look back and say, oh, with what I know now, with 2020 hindsight, here were the 3 or 4 breadcrumbs that I like, they're threads I should have picked up and I should have followed. No, the board is absolutely responsible, even when it's difficult.
All right, we talked a little earlier about board composition. I want to turn to that now. I know it's not a new or particularly sexy topic, but it's one that's really important to the health of a company. So, Matt, I'll start with you. When should companies add their first independent director, and how does that compare with what you are seeing in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I have something that I call the rule of ones for private companies. And the first thing is add independent directors on day one. The second thing is only one founder on the board. And the third thing is for every investor on the board, add an independent to the board. So you keep a balance of independents and investors with one founder. Almost no company does any of those things. The percentage of private companies that have open independent board seats unfilled, off the charts. The number of companies that we see in our business that are Series B and C with no independents, and they still have the board that's like multiple founders and multiple VCs, that's the norm. And all those things are problems.
So we've been talking about the importance of independent directors for many years now. Why is there still such a disconnect?
Why don't I take that? Because actually, because Matt and I actually disagree some on this.
Okay.
I actually love the intimacy of a small board. And one of the things, you have much more nuanced conversations. You have much less interruption. The interesting thing about a investor director is that we will, sometimes with a broader team, have done 6 or 8 or 12 weeks of diligence and study before joining the board. And an independent never does that, right? There is no mechanism for that to happen. And so I think if the founder, for example, has a mentor or somebody who is from the business, it can be really productive to have that person as an independent. But my view is I want the board to be like a castle. It's hard to get, it's hard to get in because it's hard to get people off. And so I thought about this even like in founding a company, right? A founder that you know well, that you trust, that you've got a great relationship with, to go through rocky times is way better than doing it yourself. But a co-founder who is not perfect or mediocre is way worse. And the same is true of independent directors. And my view is a quarter of independent directors are great and fabulous, but 75% of them just take up space. And I'd rather have that be a tighter room.
It's a pretty high number.
I made up the number. I don't really know, but direction.
Let me ask you, Greg, as an investor, how do you decide whether to take a board seat, designate an independent to hold that board seat, or assume a board observer role? And how much does that decision matter to the fund and to the founder?
Yeah, it's, I think, look, I'm a little old school on this one, which is, you write fairly substantial checks, and then it's your job to do the work. And so, I don't know, 2/3 of the time or 75% of the time we're on the board. And I think we should be. And I think it really matters to companies that we do it and we do our job and we show up and, we've done the work in advance. Somebody has to do it. I think it is, I'll come back to this, like, I am confident that it makes a difference in our companies and therefore it's good for the founders. Now, I will also say, look, there are a lot of people running around with seed and Series A checkbooks who are blowhards and don't belong on boards. In that case, it's better for founders not to have them. 0 blowhards. That's my answer. Rule of 0.
Good one.
I think there's much less VCs going on boards now than there used to be. And I think it's because the industry's growing so much. There's so much money in the system. Everybody is so busy. People are looking to be free riders. They want somebody else to do it. But Tiger invented the value proposition of Whatever work we've done in advance, we will show up, we will have one meeting, we'll issue a term sheet in the meeting or not, and we will never call you again. We don't need to be on the board. And that's the value proposition that lets you shovel out $15 million in a year.
I'm curious, just to ask one point on that. Do you find that that has kind of trained founders to be resistant to more oversight, like the kind of hands-on oversight that you're offering?
Absolutely.
Yeah, completely.
Do you think fear of liability is pushing some investors to stay off the board?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think it's that.
It's fear of work.
Yeah, but it's either fear of work or it's so Greg, who's a very, very good investor, right? Greg is limited in how much capital he can deploy by how many boards he's able to physically spend time on. And I actually think COVID helped blow this up a little bit. Tiger did too, right? But one of the things that happened during COVID was people realized they didn't have to travel for board meetings anymore. So all of a sudden, if you felt like you, as a VC, could be on 10 boards, now you could be on 20. So you could shovel more money out the door. Remote board meetings are not half as good as in-person board meetings. They're like a tenth as good as in-person board meetings. And sitting on 20 boards divides your brain in 20 pieces instead of 10 pieces as a VC. So I think a lot of VCs got sloppy. And then they figured, well, if I can be on 20, maybe I don't have to be on another 10, and now I can do 30.
There is definitely an issue with overboarding. There's also an issue recently with interlocking directorates, right, where directors may be sitting on the boards of competing companies. It's something that DOJ has been looking at and cracking down on recently. There have been some public company directors that have resigned in light of DOJ pressure. But I would imagine this happens a lot more frequently in the private company space, where it's not uncommon for investors to sit on the boards of multiple portfolio companies. So I'm wondering, how should a board handle a situation where one of the directors also sits on the board of a competing company or has a competing company in his or her portfolio?
This, I think, is a really interesting topic. It's really meaty. I'll try to be brief. I think the private company traditional view is best echoed by John Doerr, who used to say, no conflict, no interest, right? You want somebody who's deep in the space, who knows it, who's connected to people who might be customers and partners and the like. And again, they had their theory of the Keiretsu. And by the way, that's broadly how venture firms work, right? And it is broadly how the startup ecosystem works. It is different in public company land. But I think it does require, it requires incredible judgment, right? I think it does happen, including unintentionally, where companies that are in adjacent segments and the segments kind of merge. I have and am in that situation now. I think the easiest...
Are you stepping down from one?
Sorry, say
Are
again?
you having to choose between two companies and you're going to step down from one, or what's the situation?
What we generally do is appoint somebody else to the board and agree that there's a Chinese wall so the whole board deck doesn't go in Slack and stuff like that. And again, there isn't...
There's an element of transparency to this that is critical, right?
Yeah, and so I think that the big thing, the big decision on this comes up front where, by the way, I spent almost 20 years, maybe I made it to 20 years on Matt's board and his prior company, Return Path. But we didn't have this issue, but you go and you say, oh, I want to invest in this thing that's adjacent. It doesn't appear that it's competitive, but basically, a version of asking for permission, like, is it all right? And then 3 or 4 years later, and the markets change, and then, ultimately, you have to be clear with those founders, and if one of them is too uncomfortable, then yes, I'll pick one board and appoint another partner to the other.
Do you think that board directors are slow to sort of raise their hand and say, I'm willing to step down from this at that point? Like, I'm thinking of Reed Hastings on the Facebook board for a long period of time, or Sheryl Sandberg on the Disney board. Like, I think they were there until they decided maybe it's becoming more obvious that the conflict is outward. And I'm just wondering how resistant some folks are to stepping off boards. Or is that more a private company thing than a public company? Does that make sense?
I think it, it depends. I think there are two factors. One is the ego vanity factor, where being on the Facebook board or being on the Disney board is a big deal, right? And again, Cheryl and Reed were already big deals, so they didn't need it, but they may have wanted to continue to be part of that. I think the other, in private company land, the bigger thing is that the firm doesn't want to give up the right to be on the board. So I think actually if the founder said, hey, it should be somebody else because there's a conflict here, I think most firms, and certainly all good firms, would flip right away.
Yeah, I think that's more of a CEO job, right? To spot those conflicts and say, I can either live with them or I can't live with them.
I want to ask one last question about board composition. There's been some DEI backlash recently, particularly in the wake of the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision. I'm wondering if you're seeing any changes in the push for diversity on private company boards.
I would say, so we've probably done 100 board searches since 2020. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the board searches we did were mandatory to find representation in the candidates. And that may not be the case anymore, but it's still highly desired. So I think it's gone from like a 10 to an 8. It hasn't gone from 10 to a 3.
So I was just last night on a call with a company we did a seed round for, and we're got a Google Doc with the firms that we're going to intro to Series A's. I basically said, okay, here are the 6 I would recommend. 5 of them were women, and his immediate comment was, "Oh, thank goodness I didn't want to have to manage it, but boy, I would really like to have." I mean, it's literally a diverse slate of potential investors, with the idea that, boy, it would be really good to start with a broader board right out of the gate. I think people still really care about it.
I've found that there's a small but maybe growing group of folks. I'm thinking about Founders Fund in particular, who are like basically the DEI experiment has failed at this point, and we're like trying to market ourselves as not focusing on that. I think some of their marketing partners are very overt about it, and like it's fascinating to me that this sort of backlash, I guess, against it. And also, if you look at Google, just fired like 50 of its employees for a sort of demonstration at some of its campuses. I feel like there's a contingent of folks who are pushing back on it being common knowledge or mandatory. I agree with you that I don't think it's like widespread, but I think some folks are sort of almost priding themselves on it to a degree, which is, I don't know, interesting to see the part of the pendulum swing that way, I guess.
I always find it interesting that the backlash is actually kind of more broadly against ESG, but people forget that the silent G is governance. So I think we should all be focusing on that. Okay, I have 2 more questions I do want to make sure we get to, because one of the reasons we are all here today is to collectively brainstorm ways to get more private companies to think about governance at all stages of growth, which is easier said than done because, as you all well know, investors and founders are busy. They're building products and customer bases, and they're not paying as much attention to governance as they should, perhaps, until there's a problem. So I want to pose this question to each of you before we delve into it more in the roundtable discussion. How do we get founders and investors to focus on governance from an early stage? Maybe even get them excited about governance.
I mean, look, when I talk to CEOs about their boards, 9 times out of 10, I get an eye roll. And a lot of what I try to talk to them about is how to flip the narrative from my board as a tax to my board as a strategic asset. And good boards are strategic assets, right? The board that Greg was talking about, my company for many years, that was a strategic asset. And I loved that board, and that was not an eye roll. And it didn't matter how much governance there was in it. I got so much out of the board. So I think part of it is how do you, how do you make governance as a service? But how do you make the overall board high impact?
I think we often say to people, look, even, that first year, you haven't shipped product yet, but it's still useful to come together, and you have to sort of bring the strategy together, and it's a focal point. And that's a good exercise for you, independent of the fact that there isn't very much to govern. Mm-hmm. And then I think the other part is actually having someone that's useful enough as a thought partner. And there are all sorts of things that venture people usually, do wrong. But the biggest thing is somebody who signs up for the board needs to read between meetings, think between meetings, talk to other people in the industry between meetings, and then have an eye for what's interesting and important to talk about, and not go down rat holes and not say, all my other portfolio companies are better, they're doing X, why don't you do X? Mm-hmm. And that ultimately, I'll come back to, well, you got to pick someone who's a partner. It's not quite like picking a founder. In some ways, it's even worse, because a co-founder you can ultimately separate and fire, but you literally don't have the contractual right to get a Series A investor who is entitled to a board seat off the board.
Mm-hmm. Don't pick a blowhard, everyone. This is the takeaway for today. Okay, last question. We have an audience filled with very experienced investors and advisors. What can these folks do to help prepare the next generation of investors, CEO, and independent board members to be good governance ambassadors?
I like the idea of like a player coach sort of thing, rather than like a scoldy sort of, you can't do this sort of thing, but also just if you're I imagine if I were a first-time founder having no idea how to run a company, or how to do it right, or what sort of moves I should be taking, I would want someone that could be involved enough and invested enough that they could provide a level of guidance without sort of being the wagging finger at me. And perhaps that's like the way to win over founders, while also being like, look, this is how you can run a company responsibly. And also, I think it's like, to your point earlier, not getting the cart before the horse. Like some of these companies are very young, and a lot of the things that we worry about maybe in hindsight are applicable to like huge multi-billion-dollar valuation companies. So I do think it's kind of like the balance, but like try to come off as like a cool dad, I guess, rather than like a scoldy uncle. I don't know.
Yeah, but look, good habits start early and bad habits start early, right? And first-time founders need good mentorship, but I would also say that first-time board members need good mentorship. One of the things we always recommend around onboarding a new board member is that you give them a board buddy. And that board buddy is hopefully someone else who's experienced, who's on your board. But if you're talking about a small, really early stage board, it could be someone who's an advisor or someone who's, more tangentially connected to the company. But board members need to learn how to be good board members too.
I think the thing that I've seen, and I haven't seen that often, but a younger investor, making his or her career and literally building a relationship with an older investor, a more experienced investor at another firm, and basically say, okay, Matt, I'm going to go find stuff. We're going to do it together. You're going to be the experience. I'm going to do 90% of the work, but I get to learn from how you operate in the boardroom. And I think at the level of a younger investor, that's an absolutely great practice. They can only get so much mentoring from me, because after the first one or two, I'm not going to be in the room with them anymore. But they still need to see a great director at work.
They also have to be told by their senior partners that it's their job to be a great director.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think some of the problem is. Right. If you think about the junior person that was on the return path board that we ended up getting off the return path board, no one ever told him not to sit in a board meeting and do email the whole time.
We're all wondering who you're talking about.
By the way, I've got one other thing that I think is important, because I'm not sure the exact composition, but a lot of, I know there are a lot of lawyers in the room, and I do think one of the things, so I was, before I started Costa, I was at Sutter Hill Ventures, one of the, Jim Gaither, who ran Cooley, spent the last 10 years of his career as a partner at Sutter Hill. And he was, he was really unique. And I think the part that was unique is, I'll say, he had this thing of thinking fast and slow, whereas you have to go through the process, but there are some things that are procedural that you can do quickly. And there are other things that are important that you've got to linger on, but being rifle shot about that. And I think, so like when I was on a public board, I hated it, right? It felt like bureaucracy. I didn't feel like I was useful. We didn't talk about any of the things that I wanted to talk about. And I think, but the lawyers set the cadence and they explain what needs to be done. And lots of times, both the founders and the board members are going through it for the first time. But I'd say it's okay to race through the relatively perfunctory stuff to make sure that the really important stuff gets done well.
Right. Well, we are at time, so please join me in thanking Aaron, Mike, Matt, and Greg.